Hello and a warm welcome to Voice of Russia's political debate program, Debating Russia. I'm Peter Lavelle. All societies have myths about themselves and others. However, myths about Russia among Western audiences are particularly pronounced and long-lasting. To discuss why this is the case, I'm joined in London by Anna Matveeva. She is a researcher at King's College London. We also have Ignaty Dyakov. He's one of the organizers of a project designed to develop positive perceptions of Russia among British schoolchildren. And here in Moscow, in Voice of Russia's studio, I'm joined by Tim Kirby. He's an analyst at RT Television. Ignaty, if I can go to you first, since you're involved in helping develop positive perceptions of Russia among British schoolchildren, what's your favorite myth about Russia that you like to dispel?
Well, not that I like the myth, but one of the reasons why we decided to start the project was that I had too many clients or potential clients in our consultancy business who would come and say, is it really safe to go to Russia? Won't I be killed when I get off the plane in Moscow or wherever? And it sounds as an absurd, but in fact, I've heard it so many times that I'd really love to fight this myth, as well as some others.
Tim, a few weeks ago we have a colleague of ours, Mark Sloboda. He was joining us, and his family came out and visited Moscow, and they're from, I think, Pennsylvania. And his parents were literally looking for people spying on them, following them. And he kept saying, well, that's something that might have happened 25 years ago, but not now. Ignaty points this out. I mean, this is a persistent myth here. Where does it come from?
First off, stereotypes die hard. But even, it was about a year ago, I won't say which newspaper, but I forgot, but it was a major American newspaper said that the second most dangerous country in the world for American tourists is Russia, which is absurd. In the world, not like in some sort of region. So that would say that maybe Yemen and Oman and Pakistan, Afghanistan, and Iraq are all safer in theory, right? Except for one of them. So that's where you get it, is you get these sort of weird myths that confirm it. But we also have to understand that when we're, especially us who were raised in the Cold War, we get the stereotype, we're comfortable with the stereotype, and that stereotype continues even if the facts or the basis of the stereotype disappears.
Anna, how about you? I mean, what is one of the myths about Russia that you continuously come across living abroad?
There are two myths which are predominant. One lives on the level of population at large, and the other is among the political elites or politicized, educated people. So the popular myth that Russians drink lots of vodka, eat lots of Borsch and beetroot, and their women are beautiful. Although this is partially true, because Russians also are quite capable of eating sushi and drinking sake, that's something which probably is not worth dispelling. It will die out of its own accord. But then there is another myth which is quite prominent within kind of educated people, we will say among elites, that Russia is so corrupt that all businesses just strive on finding some kind of access to the state, or privatizing the state, or having an ear of somebody hopefully close to President Putin, or at least his, dog groomer. And any business which will even think about entering Russia will have to be engaged in most horrendous corruption.
My first job was Alpha Bank, and this was in 1997, 1998. And I soon learned that to do business in Russia is more or less more like anywhere else in the world, is that you learn the rules of the game on the ground and you get friends, and that's what you do almost anywhere. Tim, you want to jump in here? Go ahead.
Yeah, but I was going to say is also the one thing that's interesting about what she said was she sort of divided it. There's sort of these stereotypes about like the people with the vodka and the women, and then there's these other more specific stereotypes. Like if we talk about journalists in the West tend to blast Russia for something like corruption or some sort of censorship, which they can never prove and never mention, the statistics from it. And then there's the more TV stereotypes, because I kind of badly answered your first question about where these stereotypes come from. But when I think of China, I think about things like kung fu, rice, pandas, the red flag. These are all stereotypes. That sounds very racist, but that's because that's all the information I have. I don't have any close Chinese friends, and you can't really expect people to open.
But I don't think those are necessarily stereotypes. Those are just images you have that may not be value laden. They're not necessarily negative things. You think of a panda, it's not negative.
Oh yeah, and women in Russia being beautiful isn't necessarily a negative thing either. Just like how many people in Russia are always sort of embarrassed that Russia is considered very militant, and that can be a very positive thing. So people are saying, "Oh, you guys are really, really tough and you have a good army, yeah, I'll take that stereotype. Thank you very much.
Ignacy, one of the interesting things is that when I was sitting in Starbucks, yes, we have Starbucks in Russia, in Moscow, I was going through a checklist. I wrote them down of things that I'm very critical of the perceptions of Russia in Western media, and I'm looking at the United States and Great Britain, and it's demographics. I've already mentioned alcohol consumption. Very few people realize that in the last 3 years, alcohol consumption has gone down by 25% in Russia. The ease of doing business, again, I used to be in investment banking. Doing business in Russia is getting a heck of a lot easier. It's not perfect. Internet censorship, which I'm always said there's a lot of internet censorship in Russia. I don't come across it. Then there's the presumption that everything is monolithically controlled, which of course is, I can say, equals to Vladimir Putin. Another issue, two more. The status of gay people in Russia. Moscow has a very lively, vibrant gay community. And then again, last issue, race issues. And all these things I just mentioned here, I find reporting a commentary very poorly informed, number one, intensely biased, number two. How do you explain that?
Well, my probably most probable explanation would be that the Russian government and the Russian people who are close to the media and the government are not capable or are not willing to dispel these myths. Most of the information that is fed to the media is coming from these sources, and these sources just don't want or don't know how to dispel all of these myths. And obviously, when the media comes to the point when they want to sell something hot, these topics which you mentioned are among the most probable to be talked about, and thus again the bad things would sell much better. And in this sense,
okay. If I can dissect what you just said and going to Anna here, I think it's really interesting because Ignacy has said two different things at the same time: bad PR on the side of the Russian state, which I would agree.
No PR, I would say, rather than bad PR.
Or no PR. Yeah. And then the second issue that you brought up indirectly here, and I want to go to Anna here right now, is that a lot of the reporting about what happens in Russia focuses around the values of the audiences in Western countries. And I just mentioned them, looking at race relations, looking at the status of gay people, the paragon of the internet. Anna, how do you speak to that? Because when, for example, criticism of Russia's democracy, and my reaction is always the same, is that, well, most Russians I talk to aren't really interested in democracy. But somehow that's bad for Russia.
I would say that there are two types of myths. One type is that when there is some truth in the story, but the story either is biased or exaggerated or does not capture that there is some positive dynamic. Just one example, situation in Russia with human rights. There are abuses of human rights, that's a fact. But to say that the Russian system is based on conscious abuse of human rights, that would be a myth. So things happen, but any improvement is not registered. But of course, everything which feeds, each piece of evidence which feeds into a certain line of argument is very much
reinforces it.
Then there are also myths which have nothing to do with reality.
You're listening to Voice of Russia's political discussion program, Debating Russia. I'm Peter Lavelle. If I can go to Tim here, one of the interesting things, I think you remember that during the protests 2 years ago, recently one of the protesters was arrested, and it was decided that he needed some psychological evaluation, which of course reminded everybody of Soviet dissidents and whatnot. And then I'd like to mention another story to you, the stenographer on the floor of the Congress when they were voting about reopening the government here, and this woman, she maybe had some kind of epiphany or whatnot, and it was deemed that she needed psychological evaluation.
Well, yeah, because she started screaming about the Illuminati and some other things, and God will punish them, and this and the other.
Very similar stories, but very different conclusions.
Well, the one in the United States about the United States wasn't really very covered in the first place. So, and that other one, I don't know. The thing is that on both sides, that was a bad decision on the part of both Russia and the United States. Or I should say, it's a bad decision on the part of the person who made the decision, because again, in Russia, everything is monolithic. So if one judge makes a decision, that means it's part of the monolithic system, and therefore Putin's at fault. Whereas the United States, well, the judge, just voted in. So it's again that monolithic illusion
is very good point.
Tied into this.
Ignacy, if I can go to you, I can remember very clearly it was during the Occupy movement in the United States, and there was, I think she was 81 years old in San Francisco, and she was pepper sprayed by the police. And that's tragic. But no one in American media said Obama did it. But if something happens here...
Not in the media, but on Facebook.
We have Facebook in Russia too. Ignaty, I think you're seeing my point here. Everything is deemed to be so monolithic. I've lived in Russia for 15 years, and I have to say, it's always a few degrees away, sometimes a little bit better, a little bit worse, away from just chaos, because the way I look at it, I see nothing in this country as being monolithic.
No, of course it's not. And the issue is that, again, I would probably be blaming the media in general, and I apologize for this, but I would say that it's, again, easier to think that everything is monolithic. It's easier rather than dig further and seeing why people behave like this. When you say that people try to demonize Mr. Putin, that's true. But then again, it's not him who is in charge of this. It's the myth around him. And then lots of issues happening around Russia would be because what Mr. Putin might think or what he might do as a reaction to certain things made by officials or business people, right? And it's just what people perceive, but then how it is translated, always translate, all right, that was motivated or it was inspired by Putin. It was not. It was inspired by the idea of Putin being omnipotent.
Mm-hmm. And if I can go back to you, Tim pointed out there are reasons for stereotypes, but do you think that 2 decades after the end of communism in Russia, the current political establishment is doing anything at all to dispel these myths about Russia? We do have the Olympic Games coming up. Maybe that will be a great moment to show the new Russia.
Oh, it is going to fail at that task.
Okay, wait, Tim. Let's Anna first.
I think 2 points. I think I want to return to the point which Ignaty made. What makes a good story? It has to have some juice in it. If a journalist reports Russia is becoming a normal society where people are interested in consumerism and careers and not in democracy promotion, that's kind of boring. And then on your question about bad PR, I think that the worst PR for Russian government course are Russian people themselves who travel abroad and quite often actually feed the same stereotypes which the government would like to see debunked. I live in London and I see over the last 2 decades, as you pointed, quite a lot of visitors from Russia, all sorts of people, politicians, NGOs, journalists, activists, business people, government people. They are all very negative about Russia. Most of the discourse is very pessimistic.
Is this just the nature of Russian people? Because I see this all the time too, where
yes,
people will look for the worst in a situation. I'm a very pragmatic person, and I say, well, this is a problem. Let's try to solve it. But then это ужасно. It's so terrible. And for me, it's kind of a mentality. Kashmar.
Well,
Yes,
one thing is,
it
I've heard the expression, if you don't like it, leave. And that happens a lot. And the people who didn't like it, they left. Because if we look back in the 20th century, the people who were the biggest, loudest critics of the Soviet Union would be like Solzhenitsyn and Ayn Rand. But they got that spotlight back then because they said this is awful. They sort of told people what they wanted to hear, and so they got that attention. In London, if you behave badly in Russia, commit a lot of crimes, you seem to be able to live very good in London after that. But I don't see people who are really patriotic who maybe get a nice job in London or something living that wonderful. You see, it's something like that.
Well, it's very interesting. I mean, Ignaty, if I can go to you, I mean, there's a number of Russian business people living in London and in different cities in the United States, and they get a political asylum or protection because they're against the regime of Vladimir Putin, which, if you look into the back, not everyone, but if you look in the background of a lot of these people, they used to work in financial institutions. They were being investigated for corruption, and all of a sudden, they became these wonderful patriots for democracy and human rights when, if you look at their resume before their departure, quote unquote, they had nothing to do with any of those things.
But then suddenly they appear to become
Berezovsky is a very good example.
Yeah, it's again, you never know what started what, right? What's the beginning of all these things? Whether it is just because the myths have appeared and it's just easier to use them to do certain things, or it's actually somebody's creating this myth. And I mean, Anna's point about Russians behaving badly abroad and thus feeding this bad image of Russia, it may well be true. On the other hand, we never know whether it is because media shows us bad enough and we are starting behaving similar way, or if Western people look at us and trying to find only bad things or those things of which they heard of, and they're not paying too much attention to the good things which are happening in Russia, or positive things which Russians have.
Tim, Tony Jude's one of my favorite writers on politics and philosophy. Unfortunately, he passed away a couple of years ago. But he had an interesting observation, is that the West and Russia, they're almost a binary, because they look for the worst, they find the worst in themselves in the other. And this happens in Russia, this happens in the U.S.
To a degree, but
the interesting thing is, why does Russia have to have a negative image? Anna pointed out, and I agree with her completely. If you go to the Washington Post, you could read some of the most horrific things happening in Russia, and you check the name of the author and say, who is this person? What authority do they have? Have they ever visited Russia?
I love when you hear criticism of Russia from people who are writing from another country and don't even speak Russian. That's the best. But why it happens is because Russia is different, ultimately. And it's also sort of a racial factor. Is Western Europe, which is universalist, when you look at Western Europe, our idea of democracy, our idea of this and that is for the whole world. It's the right way. We have the right to bomb your country and make you do it like that. But you darn Russians, you're white-skinned. Why aren't you doing what we're telling you to? Why do you keep resisting? Why? And it's that resistance and that difference that creates that tension. But you sort of made it like there's sort of these two poles. But if we look, in the West, there was no Western Peter the Great who came over to Russia and was like, guys, we've got to get the Ushanka fuzzy hats, we got to get the vodka and do everything like they do there because it's right. And in Russia, there's been this sort of culture of shame about Russia itself because of what Peter the Great did, and then later on, especially the 19th century when liberalism took off. But I also like to say that there's another very important point about that, which is kind of hard to say, is that the West was able to convince Russians that while in the West they had slave ships taking people from Africa, in the United States, Native Americans went from 100% of the population to less than 1% today. They were able to convince Russians that they're the barbarians and they're backwards. You see what I mean? That's another huge factor, and that all happened in the 19th century, especially after the Crimean War.
This is the Voice of Russia, broadcasting from the heart of London. From Monday to Friday, we're live here on digital from 4 p.m. until 8. We're also online at ruvr.co.uk. Tune in for current affairs, news, arts and debate.
You're listening to Voice of Russia's political debate program, Debating Russia. I'm Peter Lavelle. And if I can go to you, one of the issues, there's a gentleman named Elon Berman that came out with a book in the last couple of weeks. It's called Implosion, The End of Russia. And one of his favorite topics in the book is Russia's tragic demographics. And I find it really quite extraordinary that it doesn't take much time or effort to investigate Russia's demographics over the last 20 years. And you know what? It's not that bad at all. As a matter of fact, its birth rate is higher than most countries in Europe.
And definitely better than Japan, according to Forbes.
Okay, Forbes, they have an author over there. And again, it just seems to me that if one makes a little bit of an effort to dissect some of these issues, we can talk about Pussy Riot, Magnitsky case, all of these things are far more complex than they're ever reported in Western media, to the point it really irritates me, like for the Magnitsky case. Bill Browder's name at the Hermitage Fund was hardly even mentioned in articles when he was really the center of the case. Instead of not the man's lawyer, but his accountant. Magnitsky was an accountant, not a lawyer. If you check Reuters, this was this poor man that was killed, and I think the circumstances in which he died was wrong, but it changes the entire tone of the case. So this is what you're saying, you need the juice, right?
Can I return to the point which I was trying to unsuccessfully make before? I did not mean Russians who live permanently in the West, because that's another discourse, and they behave the way which suits their own interests, which may be for or against Russia. I mean people who have proper jobs in Russia, who most of the time are members of elite, intellectual elite, political elite, business elite, who come to the West, speak at various seminars, conferences, who write in newspapers, and who then go back to their, most of the time, quite respectable jobs. Their discourse is very pessimistic about most aspects of Russian current development. Why? Because that's a national.
Their life is, but even though their own personal lives are not that bad off.
All their lives and careers and their personal outlook may be quite optimistic, but the way they communicate developments in Russia to a Western policy audience is that it's all doom and gloom. If we have in a room somebody from, say, Latvia, somebody from Armenia, and somebody from Ukraine, they will be rather patriotic. And despite outlining some drawbacks and maybe some problems with development, but largely they will feel that they're ambassadors for their countries in the West. Russians have absolutely the opposite. stance as soon as they go abroad. Is it a Soviet legacy? Is it something which is inherited in Russian kind of national discourse? You have to talk things down rather than talk things up.
I think we have to point out to our listeners here, in the 15 years that I've lived in Russia, I've met a lot of Russians that have come back from living in the West, from studying and working, and have very happily come back. And a lot of them just say, wow, it really changed a lot while I was away. Well, they went away as children or went away as young teens, and they come back. And they're really quite surprised because, as we all agree on this panel, is that you have this information sphere that is just an echo chamber where you don't really hear other things or contrarian things to what's reality on the ground. Ignaty, can you speak to that? Because I lived in Poland for 10 years when doing my doctoral research, and everything that both of you in London are saying about Russians, I could easily say about Poles and Ukrainians that I've known in living in the United States. I don't think this is a specifically Russian phenomenon.
No, it is not. And I would think personally that it's more about Russians, again, getting along this line of saying what others tell them. Right? If others say, oh, everything is so bad in Russia, everything's so dull there, it's easier when you're surrounded by Westerners, it's easier to agree with that. It's easier to say, oh yes, actually, it's right. And then you become a superhero because you're Russian yourself and you agree with what others think about Russia. So people go along with that and they come back to their lives, as Anna said, and they just carry on, right? They still are in Russia. And then there are lots of people who would come back to Russia and say, as you rightly pointed out, that life changed in Russia, and it changed in many respects to the better, but it might be because they compare it to what they hear, and they normally hear quite bad things about Russia rather than see this development themselves.
Ignaty, you bring up a very good point. Tim, if I can go to you, as both of us are Americans here, and looking at what's going on in the United States with the economy, the national security state, and other issues like that, I still find it really quite astounding that we can have the Washington Post and the New York Times and other media outlets being very, very critical of mentalities, if we can put it that way, in Russia. When, again, going back to this kind of mirror binary thing, a lot of the things that make claims about Russia are actually real problems within their own society.
Could you provide me an example? What do you mean?
How democratic is it, okay? When, for example,
So we're going to the big pot calling the kettle black.
1.1.
Immigration
I agree, Anna's right. Immigration.
Well, yeah. So in Russia, although they do actually try to bust immigrants, and immigrants cannot just come to Russia and buy a place to live. I can't buy a place to live here. It's very expensive. It's actually much more difficult, and the situation's better. The same thing where Russians drink a lot, but in the Western world, people don't do a lot of drugs. The birth rate in Europe is terrifying if you like your culture to survive into
Even
the future.
negative in a number of
Very negative, very negative. And the only countries, if you look at a map of the European Union where there's a high birth rate, are the ones that have a lot of immigrants. So basically, there is a lot of the pot calling the kettle black. Why people do that, I don't know. But I can tell you that there's an effect of when you keep plugging into someone's mind that you're doomed, that your country's awful, it really breaks people's will and it demotivates them and it makes them give up. I'm not saying there's a conspiracy. That's very conspiratorial, but I'm saying that that's
Tim,
the result of that sort of thing.
You certainly couldn't say that about Russia, because if I go to Anna, because I heard her wanting to jump in there, just on the issue of demographics itself, and the data is clearly out there. There is a baby boom going on in Russia. People have children because they believe in the future, I would assume.
I think that there is more commonality between Russia and Western Europe, that both sides give credit to each other. There is also a higher birth rates in Britain among Muslim groups. The same thing in Russia. Birth rates are getting up mostly because North Caucasus has very high birth rates. So if we compare like and alike, our societies are affected by very similar tendencies. They play up a little bit differently. There is now more encouragement of child-friendly policy in Russia. That's changed. It is actually giving some results. But processes are very comparable.
Ignaty, I find this very interesting, the whole debate about race relations, because I read a number of articles in Western media that seemed to be gleeful about the recent race conflict that we had in Moscow. It was like, this is evidence of the coming race war in Russia.
Well, when your ultimate joy in life is to see Russia die, I'm sure that does provide a little bit of glee for that type of person.
Okay, Ignaty,
sorry.
I want to go to Ignaty, but maybe that's the same answer.
Well, in general, I think that, and I would definitely agree with Anna, that there are so many similarities between Western people and Russian people, as well with Asians as well, in a sense that all the processes are the same. And if we look at history as well, all this happened before, and what we see now in Russia is just because we have too many issues there that at least something should come up. And the let's say war between races, if we want big names for it.
Well, yeah,
it is just one of the.
But I would say there is a difference. But there is a difference here, and Tim and I were talking about this before we started the program. Is that the Russian Empire was a contiguous land empire, and this is one of the very, not to disagree directly with Anna and you. I mean, for people in Britain, in the United States, when you have people coming from the Middle East, they've never been had a large community in, let's say, the U.S. or the U.K. But for Russia, they've been around people from the Caucasus for hundreds and hundreds of years. Islam is not it's not an alien civilization. It may not have been very close, not always amicable, but it wasn't completely foreign. Tim?
Yeah. Well, yeah, and that's definitely how the empire was formed, because there was no segregation here. That's an important thing to understand. There was never the second-class citizen. When Russia expanded and got a new piece of territory, the people were brought into the fold, which is a gigantic difference between, say, English colonization, where you go there, you try to get the local culture subdued, destroyed in a self-destructive cycle, and rape the benefits, as you could say.
I'm just wondering if it is not another myth which we have here about
we disagree in London, yes.
Okay, go ahead.
About what?
We got 2 minutes. Go ahead, Anna first.
Things have changed in
Yeah.
the last 20 years. What was more holistic civilization is no longer. People from Chechnya, Dagestan, and Tajikistan are as alien as people here who come from Africa. So,
well, you know what? When they all speak Russian, when you're standing at an immigration line and you're the only person there who doesn't speak Russian as a native language, you'd see that there's the differences aren't that big. And I've been to Kyrgyzstan and I've lived in Kazakhstan, and things are a little bit different, but it's all part of that big Rus, as you could maybe say.
people who come to London from Pakistan speak English. In that sense, they are part of this kind of English-speaking community. That doesn't
But they're
make
not
them
bred into
closer.
that culture.
Ignaty, jump in. Go ahead. We're almost out of time.
I would just say that it might be one of the biggest myths, actually, that Russia is homogeneous, right? That we have so many different people there speaking Russian, and thus they are Russians. They are not. And that's maybe one of the biggest issues which the West has with Russia as well, because when they see a Russian-speaking person, they assume that it's Russian, and thus all these stereotypes come up. Whereas there are so many different people there who wouldn't normally communicate to each other, and Tajiks and Russians wouldn't normally come to the same table unless there are certain circumstances. So in this sense,
I've been at a lot of holidays and funerals in Kazakhstan where all of those ethnicities of the former Soviet Union were present. Do not lie on this program.
It's a unique experience, and it is a positive
Oh, it was a unique experience at that funeral that a lot of people with different types of eyes were at the same event. That was just a one-time fluke. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, we've run out of time. Kind of an awkward note here. I want to thank Anna and Ignaty in London very much for joining us here. I want to thank Tim here for joining me here in Moscow on Voice of Russia's program, Debating Russia. I'm Peter Lavelle. Stay with VOA.